you salty sailors, time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr!
The terms are three, to this attend, and let not conclusions a term extend. Now, Donald Trump says that he wants to make America great again. And Michelle Obama replies that America was never great, thus setting up a classic fallacy of four terms. When Donald Trump says he wants to make America great again, of course he's talking about economic growth. And when Michelle Obama says America was never great, she's talking about a moral kind of greatness as defined by the woke ideology that was popular at that time. This ideological tug of war tends to set itself up in representative republics and thus blind the leadership to the nature of a paradigm shift. It seems likely to me that the next great society will be led by artificial intelligence. There may always be some human or group of humans nominally at the helm of such a society, but they will rely on advanced computer modeling with automatic inputs and real-time updates to determine the best decisions. This society will recognize that leadership as we know it today is very flawed. That the one great lesson from the blood-soaked pages of history is that people who want to be leaders should never be. People who want power over other people are sociopathic at best. They are not psychologically fit to wield the power they desire. And people have recognized this flaw, and through the centuries, with great struggle and so forth, have attempted to remedy it. We've moved from the absolute rule of kings and queens and emperors to limited rule through Magna Carta and so forth, then to various parliamentary structures, and finally to representative republics as we know it today. The, the power was distributed wider and wider and wider. So the question we're asking is, what is the next step in the wider distribution of power? Now, let me be clear that you will not be led to this next step by the political class. They, just the opposite, they are leading in the opposite direction. They want to go back to centralized power. But consider, when we scan the blood-soaked pages of history, whether the fault lies with the leaders entirely, or does the fault lie with those who followed? Alexis de Tocqueville and Voltaire and others who criticize democratic societies have been proven right to say that the flaws in human character cause a predictable trajectory for societies that rely on large groups of people for decisions. In other words, democratic societies. It will pass from democracy to republic, and perhaps bifurcate to empire or collapse into socialism and exhaust itself that way. But either way, the collapse will come. And so we're distributing power so widely as to include machines and artificial intelligence in order to remedy this trajectory that's caused by human nature, by flaws in human character. So I am not talking about using technology as a means of bolstering either the Epicurean or Stoic side, the argument that always sets itself up in a representative republic. We're not using technology to reinforce some a priori conclusion. Instead, I'm talking about a much more open-ended use of technology, a form of government that the world has not seen yet. It would have limited democratic input. The chief political concern of a member of this society would not be advancing their particular ideology, but protecting the integrity of the artificial intelligence from the corruption of such decadent ideas. Maybe you have several independent AIs, and if one is determined to have become ideological, the others can vote it out, or so to speak. A society does not enjoy the benefits of the rule of law if that law is applied selectively. But beyond that, to have a continuity, to have an element of the government that lasts far beyond uh, the a single human lifetime, to prevent the generational selfishness I've seen within my own lifetime of pursuing a generation's immediate desires and passing their problems on to the next generation. So here we are southbound on Highway 17, just south of the town of Stanhope. And as you can see, the north is indeed flat until we come to a peculiar area where these strange small hills appear. Now, these are quite different than the rolling hills of southern Iowa, which are clearly an erosional landscape. And not to say that erosion doesn't occur here, but there's something different about these strange little hills. And I believe these are actually glacial moraines. And it is also in this same area that we begin seeing here and further north these strange little marshes that don't seem to drain anywhere. It's very different than the erosional landscapes we see elsewhere in Iowa. So I think these are piles of dirt and sediment and so forth that have been scraped up by glaciers and deposited here where their journey ended. At any rate, there's a transition in this area from the flat topography of northern Iowa to the rolling hills of southern Iowa. It's hard to imagine, of course, that ice did this, but I've personally seen some quite remarkable things by a relatively thin sheet of ice on a lake that is beginning to thaw so that the ice can be pushed by even just a gentle breeze is enough for the ice to scrape up and pile big piles of gravel and so forth. It's probably not so much of a singular front that's scraping the ground like the edge of a knife, but it's rather broken pieces getting piled up and pushed into a huge pile by the amount of ice behind it. The cumulative amount of energy needed to transform the surface of the earth like that is huge. And as I've said in previous videos, it is unlikely, very unlikely in my opinion, that you get that sort of effect if the cause is simply lowering the overall amount of energy available to the system. Rather, I think there was and energy input. Uh, Keeping in mind an energy input to a planet that's 70% covered with water. There was a large energy input, and the process of dissipating that energy resulted in these transformations of the surface of the Earth. These massive glacial moraines and glacial erratics, huge boulders, moved around in various places. We're not necessarily talking about a thermal energy input. I think it more likely a kinetic energy input, probably an asteroid impact. Uh, Although the ocean would have to be comparatively hot to today's ocean in order to move that amount of water from the ocean basins onto the land. So there were thermal uh, results, but the the initial cause seems likely to me to have been kinetic, especially something like an asteroid impact. Now, of course, it's possible to imagine some kind of scenario where everything is set up and balanced just so that a, a reduction in solar input or some cooling effect uh, comes along and triggers this cascade that leads to a large release of stored energy. But the more complicated and convoluted, the less and less the likelihood of such a thing actually happening. And it's generally there's a circular reasoning, employed in that sort of argument, where we know it happened because here we are. that's that's not a logically sound argument, and even very intelligent people who should know better for some reason when they go on television wind up saying some logically unsound things. But anyway, the point is that it's very unlikely that this huge release of energy needed to transform the surface of the Earth was not caused by a simple lowering of the sun's output, so that the sun entering some phase of lower output, or some other cooling event. Rather, it is much more likely that there is a proportionally large energy input into a system that contains a large amount of water, and therefore you have these water driven effects. And of course, I'm not qualified to offer a detailed model of an asteroid impact. It, it's always more dynamic, more complicated than than we would initially imagine. Um, and so, of course, there may be mechanisms that, aside from the simple uh, heating of the ocean, that evaporation falling as snow and ice because the sun is blocked by further evaporation or other water in the atmosphere, or perhaps volcanic output and so forth. Uh, Falling as snow and ice then and accumulating over time. There may well be other mechanisms involved here, but generally, the general principle that it, uh, to a large effect requires an equally large cause. And just to wind things up here, there seems to have been a taxonomic revision. I have not read the paper yet or anything, but Gyromitra brunea is now Neogyromitra brunea. So that perhaps is reflecting that they are different than the old world Gyromitra that contained that higher amount of gyromitrin.